Okay, Donna, sound check. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, yes.
Beautiful. Welcome back. And welcome everybody to another episode of our Association Leadership Series. And Happy New Year. I'm not sure how late into January you can say that, Donna, but it's our first one of the year. So Happy New Year to everybody.
The whole month. Happy New Year.
My name is James Donnelly. I'm the founder and CEO of the Castle Group. And we are joined once again by the great Donna DiMaggio Berger, shareholder at Becker. Donna, I had your name up as Donna Berger once, and you reminded me that your parents watched this, and I needed the whole name in there. So there you go. And
you'll answer to them, James.
Yeah, well, you know, my mom and dad are back in Florida for the first time in 2 years, and I'm sure they're watching as well. So welcome everybody. And you know, I wanted to start the year by saying thank you. You know, we have over 300 people registered today, Don, and what that tells me is the interest level of the leadership of the communities in Florida is so high. They want to learn, get better to be a leader in their community. But for the last 2 years with COVID and the Surfside tragedy and just the social unrest, being a leader has been a tough time. So I wanted to begin the year by just saying thank you to all of you that are participating today and all the other leaders out there for leading these communities. I know the pay is terrible, but your communities truly appreciate it. I also wanted to bring up, Donna and I have both received a lot of calls and emails about whether we're monitoring the 2022 legislative session in Florida. And we are, of course. Donna and Becker have an organization called Call, and Don, I'll let you mention that in a minute. And then, of course, we're involved with all of our other management companies in something called CEO of Management Companies, COMC. And so I think, Donna, the big one's clearly going to be, there's always a bill that affects lots of little stuff in associations. But I think the one that's going to be very impactful is the one that really fell out of the Surfside tragedy as it relates to inspections and reserves. And I know it's way too early to evaluate, but any kind of preliminary comments on where you think we're going on that topic?
Well, I'm so glad you brought this up because the 2022 legislative session, James, is going to be significant. We say that every year, but this year for sure. There have been 21 filed bills. Many of them have taken and incorporated parts of the Florida Bar's task force recommendation that was convened post Surfside. So as you mentioned, we've got several bills that are looking at changing reserve funding, requiring annual engineering reports, changing the way reserve studies are done, when they must be done, and who can perform them. So we're going to see a lot of significant changes. You're right, when you mentioned an omnibus bill, what tends to happen in Florida is that a lot of legislators feel very passionate about a topic and they propose their own bill, but as those bills wind throughout the committee process, they tend to get lumped into what we call an omnibus bill, which can exceed 100, 150 pages. The problem in Florida with your omnibus bills and without having a line item veto is that you may have a bill with 10 great ideas and 50 horrible ideas, and you have to evaluate the bill overall on whether it has more good stuff or more bad stuff. So we'll be looking, like you will at Castle and other management companies, to see how this all plays out. Reform is always a good thing as long as it's targeted, and again, it's more helpful than hurtful. And then the other thing to look at is, while our Florida legislature is proposing all these bills in terms of community association operations, there are also bills that have been proposed, shockingly, that will reduce the ability of Florida consumers to go after builders for defective construction. So it's going to be a wild ride, and it's really hard to coalesce those two things in terms of making communities safer. On the one hand, you're doing a lot in terms of putting responsibilities where they deserve to rest in communities, but on the other hand, you're making it much more difficult to go after developers and contractors who performed effectively. So we'll see what happens.
Yeah, and we will of course do a whole webinar on this topic, Donna. But I do want to let our audience know there may be an ask from you, the community directors, if we need to rally behind legislation that we don't think is good. And a couple of examples are, they're certainly trying to shift liability and responsibility of things that aren't done onto management and board, and I'm not sure that's going to really work well with all the volunteers that you are. Okay, just quickly, I wanted to remind you, we've been asked again for some past episodes. They are all up at castgroup.com. If you have any questions about that, info@castgroup.com. Also wanted to remind you that Donna's going to give us lots of brilliance today, but it's not legal advice unless you're her client. Donna's obviously a Florida lawyer, so I know we have some listeners from Texas. You know, I think most of the principles of what we're talking about will apply universally. And we have condos and HOAs on. In fact, one of the things I'd like to do, we're going to have polling questions. And Mary Ness, put up polling question 1, because it's helpful for Donna and I think the audience to know who's on with us, condos, co-ops, or HOAs. And if you have any question along the way, just send them in. We have someone monitoring them here. We won't necessarily answer all your questions, but if I see a bunch that are together, I'll ask them to Donna. So what we're going to talk about today is a quick COVID update. Both Donna and we here at Castle got a lot of questions about what adjustments we should make to our policies in our communities because of the Omicron variant. And so we'll do a quick update on that, and then we're going to jump right into annual meetings and some of the pitfalls that Castle and Becker have seen that we hope to help you avoid. So I think share the results, Mary Ness, of the polls, and that'll give our audience. So not surprisingly, I think a few more condo than HOA, especially Donna. Some of the election nuances are a little more complex in condos and co-ops than in HOAs. Okay, let's go into polling question 2. We want to get a flavor from you about what's going on in your community with COVID. And Donna, while that is up, it's amazing ride. We were down to about 1,000 cases in Florida, 2,000 in Texas in November, all the way up to 125,000 on January 10th in Florida. And I think it peaked at 75, and now it's starting to come down to 40 a day in Florida and 50 in Texas. But one of the things that's changed is you're allowed to or you can home test. Home tests are so available now. I actually think those numbers are quite a bit higher. Yeah. But what do you, the question, actually, we'll wait for the results to come in here. We are asking 2 questions. Are you aware of any active cases in your community? And then have you made adjustments? And Donna, I think that the first question I've been getting a lot of is, the emergency powers are gone. Do I still, as a board member, have the authority to implement mask wearing or restrictions on amenities and whatnot? So can we as board members still make these rules in our communities without the executive order that we had throughout most of COVID?
Yeah, I'm getting those calls too, James, and here's what we're talking about. So, you know, last year, the emergency statutory powers were all amended in each of the 3 statutes to include specifically pandemics, okay? So that law was amplified to include what we're dealing with still, COVID. The statutory emergency powers do not end. They do not have a finite termination date under the statute. So the statute is wisely worded to say that even though, for instance, in Florida, I'm not sure when Texas's ended, but Florida's state of emergency ended about 10 months ago. However, the statutory emergency powers refer to the fact that they continue as long as is reasonably necessary. Now, arguably, given the Omicron variant, the positivity numbers in Florida and elsewhere, they're still reasonably necessary. This is one factor that boards have to take into account. You've got a variant. What does your demographic look like? Do you have a vulnerable population? By the way, do you have elevators or other cramped indoor spaces where people really cannot socially distance? We also have to look at the fact that in Florida, we have a line of cases starting with the Hidden Harbor v. Basso case, which says, and this is settled law in Florida for decades, James, that boards have reasonable rulemaking authority. The rules have to have a reasonable basis. But again, if we're looking at what's going on both in our community, both in terms of our infrastructure, in terms of the threat from COVID, those line of cases would only reinforce a board's ability to pass reasonable rules and regulations related to their common areas. And then lastly, we've got the COVID shield liability law that you and I have talked about so much, James, which says that an association will be protected from lawsuits related to COVID transmission, but they have to be following the guidance, public health guidance. And if the CDC is still recommending wearing masks indoors. Now, I've had really quickly a few people go, well, the CDC is not mandating masks. True, but again, remember what we're talking about. The CDC is not saying don't wear masks. They're saying we recommend you wear masks. So that is one factor that goes into whether or not a board rule to mandate masks inside is reasonable.
Well, that's really interesting. Marinette, let's share the results for our audience. We have 64% of our communities, Donna, that know of an active case, and I'm sure it's more than that, and probably 100%. But I think it's an important point you had brought up to me the other day is there has to be a foreseeability as it relates to liability, and we have 64% of our communities that know that there's COVID, and that should impact the decisions they make. And then we have, can you scroll that down a bit on the polling? We have 23% have increased, some have decreased, Donna, and 85% no change. So the only one that surprised me a little bit is decrease. The only reason I could possibly see that is with Omicron, it just doesn't seem to matter what you do, it goes everywhere. And I think people maybe have thrown up their hands, but I will tell you, I've told you all, I live in a high-rise condo that we don't manage, and there's no mask requirement, and there's no way. I mean, I always wear my mask going down the elevator. I just can't. If you're on an elevator and someone has Omicron COVID, you're probably going to get it. But there you go. So I think the big
James, let me just interject really quickly. The problem is, I mean, that's a very high percentage of our listeners who know they have COVID in their midst. You don't know if everybody in your community is vaccinated or not. You don't know if every guest is vaccinated. And as we know, Omicron, from what the public health experts are saying, it will tend to have less severe consequences for vaccinated folks. That's really not true for the unvaccinated. So again, this could have severe consequences for unvaccinated people. We're still seeing deaths related to the Omicron virus, the Omicron variant. And as you said, and as we talked about before, everything when we're talking about liability boils down to foreseeability. So if you know you've got people in your community who are positive for COVID right now, that again is one of those factors that goes into the column that may make you say, you know what, we want to make sure people are wearing masks inside.
Well, I think what in your prior comment, Donna, I think a lot of our listeners will be maybe surprised that they still have the authority. And an example you gave me is at all points in time, a board has the authority to make reasonable rules. And you used the example of, you got to wear shoes and a shirt in the lobby. Like that's a rule we almost all have. Well, you have as a board that kind of authority. Obviously, any fundamental different changes in policy you're going to make in community should run it by your attorney. But right. I think there's more latitude, Donna, than maybe our listeners would have thought they had based on your comments.
The Supreme Court, the United States Supreme Court, just rejected an argument where it was a objection to the federal aviation mask mandate. So we are finding that judges are erring more on the side of caution when it comes to the facial coverings right now. So again, but ask your attorney for a legal opinion if you're thinking about requiring masks or thinking about letting them go. I would get that opinion because that's your safety net as a board.
Donna, we have a couple questions about whether the board has the authority to mandate vaccines and masks, and an example being a vendor or an employee. Could an association mandate that all their teammates are vaccinated?
You know, when it comes to hiring folks, sure, you could say we want to hire this particular company to do some work, but we want to make sure you're only sending us vaccinated employees. You have the ability. Now, this is hiring an outside company, let's say to landscape. But when it comes to your own employees, you're going to have some issues. You need to talk to counsel. Look, there are legitimate reasons for exemptions to vaccines. So it's not so cut and dry when it comes to what you can do inside. And we've talked before about mandating vaccines for residents. That's just that's a no-go. That is just way too hard unless you're, my smallest community is 5 units. So maybe if they all got together and agreed on that. But what we're doing in my contracts is when it comes to outside contractors, we're not mandating vaccines, but we are mandating that they wear facial coverings and that they not send any employees to the property who are sick or exhibiting any signs of illness.
And from a management perspective, similarly, we encourage or require, some of our communities are different, masks, and the vaccination requirement is, it's first of all, it's hard enough to get people to work. Like our big problem is filling all the seats right now. And if you put a vaccination requirement, you're going to have a bigger problem. I know a lot of our listeners are aware of that. So masks, yes, vaccination, you know, it's fraught with problems to implement it. So those are kind of our high level response to that. Okay, Donna, I want to move on to annual meetings and some of the pitfalls that you've seen. Any last words on COVID? We have, I think those are most of the questions that we've got about COVID. Any last comments, or we're going to move on to annual meetings?
The only thing I would say with COVID, last comments would be, don't make assumptions. Reach out to counsel, get a legal opinion, figure out what you can do. Perfect.
Okay, Mariness, I'd like to start with putting up polling question 3. What we're going to dive into now, Donna, is kind of some framework around annual meetings. And the first one I wanted you to address was really authority. Like, what is the requirement to have an annual meeting, and where do we find that requirement or our authority to have or not an annual meeting?
You look in both the statute, for instance, 718, 719, they reference an annual meeting. Every set of documents I've ever looked at discusses an annual meeting, James. Normally, some of them are very specific. They'll say you have to have it in the 3rd Tuesday in February. I honestly recommend loosening that up a little bit, giving yourself a little more flexibility. But in terms of authority for holding an annual meeting, not even authority, but obligation to hold an annual meeting, it's derived from the statute and the governing documents.
And that's for condo and HOA.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well,
okay.
the HOA does not, the HOA no, but you're looking at your documents in the HOA.
Yeah. Mariness, please share the results of poll question 1, whether our associations even have a quorum to have the meeting. And actually, I'm quite impressed, Donna, 78% yes. I mean, we have a lot of more so big HOA communities where people don't tend to see each other every day in the elevator in the lobby. This is probably not a surprise because we have more condos and co-ops on this call than HOAs, but it does show, I mean, 20-some% don't even get to a quorum. But I think that you made a couple good points there. Number one, you know, most of these associations watching have been doing this for years. They know what their documents say, what the law says. They've bounced it off their counsel. But we've talked for now 2 years, Donna, about it's probably time, especially for our older communities, to update their documents. And you made a very good point. Some of these developer documents say your annual meeting shall be on this date and this time. Highly restrictive. I mean, COVID is a great example of that. So there would be an area maybe you could update your documents to give yourselves a little more room to schedule your annual meeting.
Because you may just have that one person who likes to argue with you over everything. And if you hold the meeting at 7:30 and your documents say 7 o'clock, you've committed a technical violation. So if you have that restrictive language, it just makes sense to amend it and give yourself a little more option. You know, you'll have your meeting at a date and time in February. And that way, at least people know what month it's going to happen. But it gives you some latitude when it comes to choosing a date and time.
In our discussions yesterday, Donna, in preparation for this webinar, you made a good point. I'd like you to talk to our audience about the notice requirements, where they would reside, and some of the unique circumstances given what's going on with our postal service and whatnot. So please address condos and HOAs, but we have a lot of even candidates that maybe don't get their application in time. Please talk to me about some of these notice requirements and some of the current difficulties.
Sure. So Florida condo and co-op is going to require a 60-day first notice. And then the second notice is 14 days. That second notice is going to contain the ballot if you're going to have an election. You're not going to have an election if you don't have more candidates running than seats open. I want to circle back to that full question on a quorum. Some people in Florida still don't understand that you don't need a quorum to have a Florida condo or cooperative election. You only need 20% of your eligible voters to cast a ballot. And the legislature did that, James, because historically it's been difficult to achieve quorums in these communities. And I'm really somewhat surprised that it was, less than 30% that had that issue, because in the past we've seen it being more of an issue. And I also wonder whether or not that's born out of the fact that more people are attending virtually, so it's easier to get that quorum. But in terms of the notice, the 60-day first notice, now the 14-day second notice, 40 days to submit your notice of intent to serve. You are correct. The U.S. Postal Service right now is suffering from what everyone's suffering from, which is a labor shortage. People either quit or they're sick, and we know that the Postal Service is incredibly slow. So just because the statute says at least 14 days for that second notice with the ballot, doesn't mean you can't send it out 30 days ahead of time. You can give yourself more time. By the way, your documents, your condo or cooperative documents may require you to send it out 20 days. So you need to look at the documents as well, because if your documents have a more restrictive requirement, meaning they require you to send it out with more notice than what the statute references, you need to go with the greater notice required by your documents. Now, in Florida, if you've got a very small community, 10 units or less, your community could vote to opt out of these complicated election procedures. In the HOAs in Florida, this is document driven, but some homeowners associations, and I represent many of them, have decided to get away from the proxy voting because that can be problematic. People can go collect a bunch of proxies and basically control who gets elected. Some of those HOAs in Florida, James, have voted to institute a condominium style election protocol, which is the first notice and the second notice.
That's interesting. A couple things I want to pick up on. I always like to have, very specific take home value. You said you don't have to have meet the HOA or condo quorum requirements to have an election. You do to have an annual meeting, but for an election, it's statute driven. You only need 20% or 30% to have an election.
20% in a condo or co-op in Florida. In an HOA, that's not the case. But remember that the Florida legislature reduced the quorum requirement for HOAs to 30%. So in a Florida HOA, you do need your quorum to have that election. Unless you've amended your documents to adopt the condominium style and say 20% cast ballots.
I've got some questions coming in here, Donna, on the use of proxies to achieve quorum. Can you just repeat or be maybe more specific on condo versus HOA and the use of proxies to achieve quorum?
Okay, so let's take a Florida condo and co-op. You could do a general proxy, James, if you want to have the meeting, because remember, in a condo or co-op, you've got two things going on. You've got the election and you've got the meeting. You need a quorum to have that meeting, to do the officer reports and any other votes you want to take. So you may want to have a general proxy to establish a quorum in a condo or co-op. You do the election first, you get that out of the way. Now, if you're voting on anything else, you can achieve that through a limited proxy. Maybe you're voting on waiving reserves or partially funding reserves, or you're voting on a material alteration or an amendment. In an HOA, you just use a proxy, right? You just give your general proxy, but in an HOA in Florida, you need to allow people to nominate themselves from the floor. unless again, you've adopted as an HOA board an advanced nomination procedure. So that proxy in an HOA serves two purposes. One, to establish the quorum, but also your proxy holder can vote for whomever they want, as opposed to a Florida condo or co-op where it's an anonymous election ballot and that owner is casting his or her own vote for the candidate of his or her choice. So that's the difference. There's been some proxy abuse in HOAs over the years because you don't know how your proxy holder is going to vote.
Interesting, very interesting. Okay, now, what if we don't have as many candidates as there are open positions? What happens then in both condo and HOA?
So there's no election. You're not going to have an election, and the people who have submitted their names, and now this only applies to condo and co-op and HOAs who have adopted this procedure. If you have an advanced nomination procedure, James, and you've said, I want to put my name in, and there's no election, you put your name in, you walk on the board. Some, believe it or not, some incumbents actually get this wrong because they don't think they have to put their name in and they don't fill out the notice of intent. And then they're not walking on the board if there's not an election. So if you want to serve on the board in a condo or co-op or an HOA that has adopted this, you're going to put your name in. Now in an HOA, if you don't get any nominations from the floor, your current board just stays seated.
Yeah. Okay, good. Well, that was a question. Now, the other question that's come across is, my board didn't hold the election. What do I do as an owner to compel the board to hold the annual meeting and or the election?
Well, first I'd want to find out why they didn't hold the election. Maybe they're in the process. Maybe there was an error with the first or second notice. Maybe they're working with counsel to do it over again and they're just not communicating that. So my first bit of advice would be find out why there wasn't an election. What's going on? Is it that there was a mistake and they're trying to fix it? If the board has just decided we're not having an election this year, that's a problem. And that's why there are resources like the Ombudsman's office and the division that the owner can reach out to and say, hey, I think there's a problem.
Okay, I want to actually move to who can run. And so I would like, Mariness, for you to put up poll question 4. Are you getting enough candidates to have an election? This is all segueing nicely in here, Donna. Who is eligible to run for election and who's not in an HOA, condo, and or co-op?
So you need to look in 2 places, James. You need to look at the documents. You need to look at the statute. Let's start with the documents. Again, we get back to don't make assumptions, because in some communities, in some developer documents, they allow non-owners to serve on the board. And that was never removed from the documents. So I do have some communities, James, where it's wide open. Anybody could run for the board. I could run for your board. You could run for the board. It doesn't tie it to record title ownership. In other communities, it will say an owner or the owner's spouse may run for the board. Some communities don't allow corporate ownership, or if they do, they limit who in the business entity is eligible to run for the board. So it really starts with looking at the documents, and this applies to HOAs, condos, and co-ops. Look at the documents. What does it say? If it says members can run, then you need to go into the definition section, James, and see who constitutes a member. Is it a record title owner? Is it somebody else? Look at the documents. And then in terms of the eligibility requirements, the Condo Act and Cooperative Act, they will tell you that, look, if you've been a convicted felon and your voting rights have not been restored, you're not eligible. If you're delinquent in the payment of assessments 90 or more days, you're not eligible. If you've been charged with a crime, you're not eligible. So, for instance, on the notice of intent, I know Castle does this, we do this. We put out the conditions of eligibility right on the notice of intent, and it is somewhat of a honor system, right? That if somebody's putting their name in, they're really not a convicted felon whose rights have not been restored. We can talk a little bit about whether or not an association should do background checks and figure out whether or not that's correct information.
Well, we're not, that's a bit deeper, I think, than we have today. But we've lit on my question board is lit up here, Donna. So several questions around what if I don't have enough candidates to fill out the board? How do you choose the rest of the board members?
Remember, we talked about this. Everybody had, let's assume we're talking about a Florida condo or cooperative. You've put in your name, okay? You've got 3 seats open and you don't have 4 people running. Whoever put in their name is going to be on the board, okay? In an HOA, it's different unless they've adopted the condo style. If you don't have an election, the current board stays seated. Now, in a condo, it may be the current board. You may have the 3 board members who all filled out their notices of intent and nobody else is running, so it may be the same board. It really is tied to who put in their notices of intent and how many people are interested in running.
I think the question, Donna, is I've got 5 positions on the board. I've got 3 candidates. You know, they're acclaimed. How do I fill the other 2 seats?
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, so if that's the case, if only 3 people, you're filling vacancies. So the 3 directors would vote to fill those vacancies.
From any eligible owner.
Correct. So, you know, and unless your board has passed a resolution or you have a policy in place that says, and I've seen this in some cases, James, it says you have to take like the next runners up to fill vacancies or something like that. It really is whoever those 3 board members feel would make the best contributions on the board, that's who they fill it with.
Another question here. There's an owner, but they don't live in the community. Can they still run?
Yes, under the statute, again, I'm assuming you're referencing, you know, a condo. You can't make up your own eligibility requirements. The statute sets the eligibility requirements. Okay, so you can't say you need to be a full-time resident. I've seen that before. They're still eligible, particularly this. Remember, the statute says any member other than the foregoing are eligible to run for the board. So you've got that language. So those you know, internal controls you want on eligibility, check with counsel, get an opinion as to whether or not what you've got in your documents is going to be enforceable in light of the eligibility criteria set forth in the statute.
Okay, I got so carried away with the questions, I forgot to post the poll results here, Donna. Ness, please share the results. So, Donna, we have about 2/3 of our communities are getting enough candidates, but it's interestingly, you know, almost 1/3 are not. And this is what particularly concerns me, Don, about some of the draft legislation I've seen this year. If we make it so onerous or risky to be a board member, we're going to have a tough time getting boards. And one of my fears is that the legislature, in their effort to protect us, are going to land up with no board members.
James, may I just interject one other thing, because I think it's important. When we talk about eligibility, remember, we didn't mention term limits, right? So we've got 8-year term limits in Florida, consecutive terms. That does not mean that somebody who's going into their 9th year could not submit a notice of intent to serve. Okay, it doesn't mean you can't put your name in, because what does the statute say? The statute says you can override those 8-year term limits if you get 2/3 of the members to vote for you, or if you don't have more people running. So something to remember, that you don't have to just, you can still put your name in and hope for the best.
Okay, we're going to move on from who can run to how can I now run these meetings. So if I can have poll question 5, Don and I are curious, audience, how you're holding your annual meetings. And by the way, we appreciate some of you have already had your annual meeting and some of them are about to have annual meetings, but I would just reference the last annual meeting you've had or have already got in the plans. And Donna, while that's put up, you had brought up something, and I wasn't going to go there, but a couple of questions have come up about it, so I guess I will. The candidacy, you articulated some reasons why you couldn't, whether it's a felon or there's an action against you or you haven't paid your maintenance. What is the mechanism to qualify these candidates, and whose responsibility is that?
Well, I think, again, mostly it's the honor system. You have to ask yourself, do you want to be doing background checks? You could. I do have some associations, but if you're going to do background checks, it has to be against every candidate, not just the one that you're suspicious about. So there's that. I mean, certainly the qualifier regarding whether or not a candidate is current on the payment of assessments is one that you should be checking with, make sure. And again, are they current on the day that the notice of intent has to be submitted? That's the deadline. So I get that a lot. Well, can it be waived? No, a deadline, the statutory deadline is the deadline. And folks, if you were thinking about running for the board right now, and you normally mail in your assessments, it's incumbent upon you to make sure they get it. So drop it off by hand, overnight it, use ACH, whatever it takes on your end to be able to ensure that your payment is in if you're serious about running for the board. Don't leave it to chance, because as we know right now, there's some significant problems with mail delivery.
Mariness, please share the poll results. And Donna, there's questions about whether the 8 years term limits apply to HOAs or just condos and co-ops.
I believe it's condos and co-ops. I don't believe that's in the HOA statute, but I would have to double check on that. I don't think that's in the HOA statute, but I'd have to check.
Okay. How are you going to hold your annual meetings? So here we go. 25% in person, 25% virtual, 50% hybrid. Boy, those are numbers. You had shared some comments with me, and I thought you should share them with the audience about what are the risks of holding in-person meetings, especially while we're in the middle of COVID, and is that inconsistent with some of the policies that our communities have? So let me start with that. What is your advice on having a in-person meeting or not?
Well, I think our first poll question, or our second or third, was, do you know if anybody has COVID? And 63% of the people said, yes, we have COVID infection in the community. If that's the case, and you are going to have an in-person meeting, which would not be my preference for a community that has COVID in its midst, and let's be honest, most of our communities do, then you have to take certain steps. And I would recommend an outdoor meeting, on the tennis court, the pool deck, what have you. Space people out, get a microphone system, but do it outdoors. Certainly doing it indoors when you've got COVID in your midst is just not advisable. In terms of the virtual, well, you got a few hurdles. Number one, if you're going to do a virtual membership meeting, your board has to have passed a resolution authorizing virtual membership participation pursuant to Chapter 617 of the Florida statutes, which is the general not-for-profit statute. So if you haven't, if what I just said to you sounds like gobbledygook and you've never done this, speak to your attorney, because you need to have that resolution in place. And then lastly, when it comes to a condo or co-op election, there is language in the statute that says ballots have to be opened in the presence of the owners, which is why a lot of attorneys are recommending a small in-person component that can watch the counting committee. You set up the Zoom, so the Zoom is also watching the counting committee do their work, and the majority of people are joining by Zoom. By the way, James, most of the elections I've been attending are by Zoom. So the manager would hold up an envelope and say, what do you think? I can look and see if there's any issues with that envelope, and presumably it's the same thing. Everybody is watching what's going on.
Well, a lot of questions coming in on this one. So in person, you've kind of articulated some of the risks, and maybe that's not a great idea. On the flip side, we're being asked, can you do 100% virtual? And you clarified that pursuant to Statute 617, which would apply to condo or HOA or co-op, you have to have passed a resolution to allow yourself to have. So I think that's super important. I'll bet we have a significant number of our communities on in our audience right now.
You could do 100% virtual for non-election votes. So if you, and I've had many associations right now, James, whether it's an HOA, condo, or co-op, say we're going to do a membership vote on amendments. That can be 100% virtual. In an HOA, you could do an election 100% virtual, because remember, you have nominations from the floor. We have this little raise your hand feature on Zoom. So if I want to nominate myself on an HOA election, a virtual HOA election, I can just raise my hand or say, hey, I want to nominate myself. But for a condo or co-op, for the election, it can't really be 100% virtual because of that statutory language that says, there has to be opening in front of the members. I like to keep that in-person, that small in-person component for people who really don't, your people in your communities who don't really feel comfortable with Zoom. That may be a handful of people who really have never gotten on Zoom, but they want to go see the ballots open. So those are the folks I like to give priority to, those folks to attend in person.
Let's, did we share the results of how to hold the meeting? Okay, Mariness, share those results, please. No, I think we did. Yeah. Okay. So just so we're clear, because from a practical point of view, whether it's an HOA or condo or co-op, you want to be able to have a Zoom option. That's the world we're in right now. From a practical point of view, it's great to have a limited number of people who can socially distance, be in person. But I think we have some confusion based on the questions coming in. When do I pass this resolution to have virtual meetings? In what circumstances do I need and have to do that?
I think you should pass it at any time before you, I've had communities, you don't have to keep passing it, by the way, James. So speak to your attorney. Most of my communities passed those resolutions 2 years ago, and now this is an option. Look, folks, even when we're outside the threat of a pandemic, offering a Zoom option for certain membership meetings is going to accomplish a couple things. One, it's going to increase your participation, and this is true for online voting too. We've seen that offering online voting increases participation, membership participation. Holding meetings by Zoom also increases membership participation, particularly when you're dealing with people who live out of state or out of the country. Also cuts down on your legal fees. It takes me 5 minutes to hop on a Zoom as opposed to driving 40 minutes to your community and then leaving. So there's a lot of benefits to embracing technology in our communities. The answer to the question, short and quick, is the sooner you adopt a Chapter 617 board resolution authorizing virtual membership participation, the sooner you can start doing it.
I really like this. Another take-home value. I think our advice would be 100% of the audience should pass this resolution, because there's going to become a time you need it and you won't have done it. I think that's as clear as we can be on that. Okay. Nominations from the floor that you mentioned has triggered some more questions. Boy, we have an active audience today. I love it. So nomination from the floor, how do we know whether they meet all the candidacy requirements? We can't check them at that moment, other than we can likely check the currency of their payments, because we can do that online. But
remember, those eligibility requirements are condo and co-op. Okay, so you don't have nominations from the floor in a condo or co-op. It's an advanced nomination and an anonymous ballot. But
only applies to condo and HOA.
Yeah, so exactly. So in an HOA, you should know, or you should be able to check quickly if somebody's current in the payment of assessments.
Yeah, and by the way, we have a question, who votes on the resolution? I believe that's a board resolution.
That is a board.
Statute 617. Okay, clarification.
May I just add one other thing in terms of, and I may be jumping ahead, in terms of prepping, if you're in a community that has a lot of LLC ownership, check ahead of time and you use voting certificates, go on SumBiz, see who is eligible, who's associated with that LLC, and that will make the time needed to go with the night of the election to go through those outer envelopes to say, well, who's Fred Smith? What's his relationship to the Waterview LLC? You can do all of that prep work ahead of time, particularly important if you have a community with a lot of corporate or business entity ownership.
I think that's really important. And I think we're seeing an increasing number that are held that way for a whole bunch of reasons. So it does take some advanced prep. In fact, when I asked my team, what's the main pitfall of a poor annual meeting? It's all about preparation. Don't even do a trial run of the meeting, especially if you're using technology. You really should go in the day before and mock the meeting, because the last thing you want to do is find out what isn't working on the day of. Okay, we're moving right along. Questions now about electronic voting. Donna, we did do a whole session last year on this, so I don't want to spend too much time deep dive, but I do want to find out what our audiences are doing. Mariness, polling question 6 on electronic voting. Please put that up. And let me see. Everyone's asking again what that statute is. It's 617. Okay, so starting, Donna, we're asking our audience whether they're using it or not, but what do we have to do to use it? You just mentioned a resolution the board needs to pass to have virtual meetings. What do I need to do as a board member to authorize electronic voting?
Same thing, James. It starts with a board resolution. This is driven by the statute. The statute says that the board has to give notice of the board meeting at which it will adopt a resolution authorizing electronic voting 14 days in advance. And again, listen, there are resolutions and then there's resolutions. Speak to your attorney. This is not just a simple, one sentence, we're going to use online voting. There's a lot of different moving parts when it comes to online voting in terms of when you're going to start it, when you're going to end it, what the window is going to be, who you're going to use, that you're going to use a provider that has met all the statutory requirements, that the board association is not going to be responsible if somebody claims they got a virus from the third party, platform. So the resolution, my resolution is a 2-page resolution. It's not a 1-sentence resolution. So speak to your attorney, but that's the starting point. You need to have that resolution passed, 14-day notice of the board meeting. And then what you do is you send out a copy of that resolution together with a consent form, because the statute says that people have to consent to online voting in writing.
It's that second piece, I think, super important. The resolution is something the board can do, but
Right.
each member has to consent to doing the electronic voting. Is that correct?
Yes, that is so important what you just said. People get confused and they think the members have to consent to online voting to even offer it as an option. Not true. The board alone can have a vote and say, we want to offer this as an option. They could put it out there and not a single person could actually consent to use it. Doesn't mean that it's still not an option. At that point, your board may say, well, it doesn't make sense to hire to use a platform if nobody has consented. But that hasn't been the experience, James. The experience has been that year after year, when a community offers it as an option, the participation increases incrementally each year in terms of people consenting to online voting.
Okay, let's share the results. This is interesting to me, Donna. We have only 25% are using. Now that's, as you said, that's going up every year. And I actually see 5 or 10 years from now, those numbers are going to invert because it just makes sense to do that. I do, though, you had mentioned the requirements to pass a resolution and to get consent. Is that condo and HOA?
I'm sorry, say that again, James?
So you had mentioned the requirements a board must go through to authorize both the use of electronic voting and the consent.
Yes, that's across the board.
Yeah, that's what I thought. Okay. And so another distinction, just because the nature of the questions coming in, an electronic voting platform is a specific written software, especially in condos and co-ops where you need to have confidential anonymous voting, that's designed just for that. You can't accomplish that with Zoom because you don't have the anonymity.
No.
So if you want to know more about the electronic platforms, we actually have a link at castgroup.com under this association leadership series, and it lists 6, including Becker Ballot, Donna, platforms that have been used in our company and all comply with Florida law, which is important. Now, can a HOA who's not required to have anonymous voting, can they use Zoom for their election? Can you vote by Zoom?
Could an HOA? I guess you could vote by a show of hands. Yeah, I guess you could. I guess if you had let's think a small HOA. Let's take a 20-unit HOA that does not have an advanced nomination procedure. They do nominations from the floor. Yeah, I guess they could do it by show of hands on Zoom.
Meredith, please share the results on the electronic voting.
Remember, everybody would have to be on at that time. That's also the beauty of online voting, is that you have a window, James, typically of a couple weeks where you can go in and cast your vote. So even in that example, you would have to, and you may be in another part of the world where it's 7 o'clock here and, 7 at night here and 2 in the morning somewhere else, if you're doing that.
Yeah, well, all of this electronic voting and virtual meetings, you mentioned it, but I want to reinforce, if you want your participation of your owners, this is the way to do it, especially in COVID, and especially because we have so many people who don't live locally. So I highly encourage that.
You also don't have the delivery issues. We had problems with Canadian owners not getting their election materials in time, even before COVID. We had issues. 14 days is cutting it close in some instances to turn around, to get the materials there, have them fill it out and get it back. We had those issues previously. Those have only been heightened during the pandemic and with the labor shortage. So online voting just makes that so much easier for your out-of-state and your international owners.
You're not saying Canadians are slow, are you, Donna?
Never.
Oh, okay.
In deference to my host, never.
Yeah, I know I have a lot of my Canadian friends on here. So, okay, let's get that poll question down. Put up poll question 7. Donna, we're moving to game day. It's now our election. Who chairs our annual meetings?
Again, mostly this is choice and what your documents say. So your documents say that the president chairs all meetings. That doesn't mean that if I have a president, James, who doesn't really want to chair the meeting, that he or she can't delegate that to either a fellow board member or the manager or me as the attorney. So, you're not tied to that. It really is a question of choice, of preference. Sometimes I've got board members where they really want to chair the meeting. They want to control the meeting. Others, that's just not their skill set. They're not happy with that. So they may ask me or manager to chair the meeting or fellow director.
Please share the results, Mayor Ness. It looks to me like the president most of the time is chairing, property manager 25%, and the attorneys, you know what, Don, you just can't trust those attorneys to run the meeting, obviously. I really like having the attorneys come in and run the meeting, especially if there's any kind of adversity or turmoil around the election or what's going on in the community. I'm a bit surprised it's that low, but it's an expense, so I understand that part of it. But I think if any of our audience is having any issues surrounding their annual meeting of the election, get the attorney to run it.
Yeah.
I think that's a good decision. Okay, so we shared those results. Now, speaking of having issues around annual meetings and elections, when does one two-part question: who should be counting the votes, and at what point do we bring a monitor in, a third party, to make sure there's, the validity of the election, which is kind of appropriate given our federal election last year, is unquestioned. So who counts the votes, and do we need a monitor?
So I'll tell you who shouldn't be counting the votes: the candidates, incumbent board members, spouses of those folks. Normally it's a counting committee, James. You can compile a counting committee in a couple of ways. One, you can ask for volunteers right there at the meeting. You can say, do we have volunteers to serve on the counting committee? Or two, you may establish that counting committee ahead of time. So the board may ask ahead of time, who can we get to count the votes? In some communities, they want the manager to count the votes. I'm not a huge fan of that. I think the manager has other roles at the meeting. People may be coming in late. People may be asking for supporting documentation if they're voting on other things. And again, also our management team, we want them to be completely neutral. We really want to take them out of the election process. So certainly a counting committee. As attorneys, sometimes we're asked, our role is to sort of oversee. I typically stand behind the table and the counting committee's here and I'm watching what's going on. You got one person that's reading it, one that's writing down, the other one's looking, and I'm looking too. In terms of an election monitor, James, that will happen if the members have petitioned the state to appoint an election monitor. But I also have a number of communities, James, that have decided, particularly in communities where there's some turmoil, to hire their own independent election monitor company to come out. I don't know if you need that if you also have your attorney present, because as attorneys, we will be there and we will be looking it over. I don't know if you need both of that. Certainly, if there's a state appointed monitor, you may want your attorney as well. I have seen some of the state appointed monitors make the wrong calls when it comes to the ballots.
This really goes back to the preparation. I know in a lot of our bigger communities, they will put out a call for monitors and they'll outline the requirements of their independence. And it certainly gives great comfort to the whole community to know that someone without a vested interest is doing the counting. It really comes back to the preparation for the annual meeting and the election. I can't emphasize that a lot, especially from the management side, to really think through, and a lot of our audience, they've done this year in and year out. And I just had a comment come in online here that they have an election committee, an annual meeting committee. They have a chair of that committee and they're very organized. And I really applaud that. Okay, we've only got a couple of minutes left. You had said a couple of things to me and I see questions about it, about if I am voting online and I vote by mail, what happens? Can I vote twice?
Okay, great question. When it comes to an election ballot in Florida, it's first in that counts. And this is why if you're accepting paper ballots in the office, let's say a date and time stamp would be helpful before it goes into the ballot box or the manager accepts that hand-delivered ballot. Online vote will have a timestamp. Remember, it's all anonymous. You won't know how Mrs. Smith has voted, but you will know she voted on January 21st at this time, okay? So with an election ballot, if we look and we see there's two ballots that Mrs. Smith has submitted, we take the first one. But when it comes to other types of votes, James, let's take amendment vote, it's the last in because people can change their vote. And they can't change it. An election ballot in Florida for a condo or co-op or an HOA that has adopted that type of procedure, it's irrevocable. Once it's handed over, and I know some communities have this, person walks into the office, they give an election ballot, 2 hours later, they come back and they say, I made a mistake, I changed my mind, give me back my ballot. Can't happen, it's done. So I would also recommend as a protocol, James, that when people are handing in their ballot, they be told this is final and irrevocable. If you use a ballot box, the same thing. Once you drop your ballot in here, you can't retrieve it. There's no changing it. And certainly online, for instance, with Becker ballot, we have a box they have to check that says, I acknowledge my vote is fine. It will be final and irrevocable. There's no mulligans when it comes to an election ballot.
That's the point I wanted to make. And we're out of time, Donna. I do want to ask you though, because I have some questions here. When do I hold the organizational meeting? I've had my election. Now we have to decide who the officer is going to be. Is that same day, another day? When do we do that? Almost always it says in the documents within 10 days, the organizational meeting. Many decide to do it that night, right after. Just make sure your notice of your annual meeting also contains language that the organizational meeting will immediately follow.Got it. Okay. We have had one of the most active chat boards ever. So it strikes me we're going to have to do a 2.0 on this topic, Donna, and we're happy to. I will tell you the next webinar, though, is February 16th. My partner, Craig Vaughn, is going to host that one, and it's on managing reserves, February 16th, same time, same place. So, Donna, thank you so much. Welcome back. We missed you in November. And audience, I hope this was helpful. Every one of your communities has got a nuance that's different than another community. So this is not an area you want to take a chance on interpreting your documents. Highly recommend you get your attorney involved to make sure a lot of the questions that you've asked on the chat are appropriate for your community. So with that, Donna, any final words? So grateful for you being here again. This was a lot of fun. I'm just happy to be back. I'm wishing everybody continued health and happiness. All right. Bye, everybody. Appreciate you joining us. Happy New Year. Bye, Donna. Take care. Bye-bye.